Hey everyone, welcome back to Justice Redesign. I'm Steve Teskey, your host. And well, this is a seventh episode that I wasn't planning um, on the series, The Compact for Obedience. For those of you who've been following me through every episode, you will recall that in episode one, I intended there to be 5 episodes. However, about into the third episode, there were new developing news information. Particularly, universities were rejecting the administration's compact for obedience, and so I felt I needed to add another episode to bring everyone up to speed on what's been transpiring. Because for me, I had made a prediction in episode one that I think most of the universities would end up rejecting it. And it seems to be happening that way. Um, but so I added what was called an epilogue. But then after doing the epilogue, I listened to an interview, a New York Times interview, conducted by a conservative opinion writer who I enjoy reading his material. It's very helpful for me to get a good uh, bent on the other side of the aisle. And in fact, his writings have made me think a lot about some things and has been very helpful for me in my essays as well as these podcasts. Now, interviewed uh, somebody who was formerly in the Trump administration. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that person, but it's what she said in the interview. It was a very long interview that concerned me. And it wasn't really what she said necessarily, but it was more what she didn't say. So after releasing the epilogue, I received a surprising number of messages from listeners, saying things like, and I'm just paraphrasing, Judge, I still don't understand how the Trump administration justified the compact, or where did this idea come from, and who was driving it. And even with those questions, I wasn't really going to do another episode. But then it was like, I don't know, coincidence, you may say, that all of a sudden the interview comes out and there was the person driving it. And in fact, the title of the interview was something to the effect of what's driving this. Okay, and it turned out to be this person. So today we're going to talk about that person, and that person is May Melman. She's not a columnist. She's not a think tank pundit, but she is a lawyer, like me. Okay, a former deputy assistant to the president and senior policy strategist who helped shape the administration's education agenda. She's a Harvard graduate. Okay, so uh, no doubt she is very intelligent. Okay, uh, and gifted. I've read a little bit more about her, and she certainly exerts very strong leadership skills. And so I am impressed with her. Although I'm going to critique her in one regard here, okay, I don't want anyone to think that I look at her as less than extremely intelligent. That's not the case. Okay. She is someone whose fingerprints are on nearly every major settlement the administration extracted from universities: Columbia, Brown, Cornell, Northwestern, Harvard, and some more. But here's the twist. In everything she says about the compact, she never once addresses the Constitution, not the First Amendment, not academic freedom doctrine, not viewpoint discrimination, not the unconstitutional conditions doctrine. I mean, all the things that are there that stand as an impediment. Um, Nothing. But yet she's an attorney, and a very smart attorney. So let's talk about that. So let me set the stage, and let's take a deeper dive into who May Melman is. Before we examine her logic, we need to understand who she is. May Melman entered the Trump administration as a senior strategist, and by early 2025, she held the title of Deputy Assistant to the President, a role with actual policy power. According to the reporting, she, number one, helped draft the administration's education policy. Two, she coordinated pressure on targeted universities. Three, she negotiated behind closed doors with university presidents. And then she delivered the compact for academic excellence to 9 flagship institutions. Now, she wasn't writing opinion pieces like Mark Rowan did in the New York Times. She was writing policy attached to billions in federal funding. And yet, when interviewed at length about her approach, she talks about the following: victimhood culture, radicalism, anti-Semitism, DEI, tuition inflation, administrative bloat, cowardly leadership, conservative students feeling unwelcome, but not about the one thing that makes or breaks the entire scheme here. Is it constitutional? So I think the silence on that says a lot, says everything. You see, as a former judge of 22 years, I've learned that what a person doesn't say often reveals more what they do. In Melman's interview, her silence, in my opinion, is really deafening. Here is a lawyer advocating for a federal policy that requires universities to limit political expression, hire more conservative professors, reduce criticism of conservative ideas, remain neutral on political controversies, and accept ideological limitations as a condition for federal funds. But yet she does not mention that academic freedom is remember, that's a special concern of the First Amendment, that the government cannot impose viewpoint-based conditions on funding, that the Supreme Court calls coercive funding conditions a gun to the head. Remember, that is a quote from Chief Justice John Roberts. Or that forcing universities to suppress certain ideas is exactly what every First Amendment case since 1967 has forbidden. Why such a glaring omission? Well, I think because the moment she brings up the Constitution, the entire strategy collapses. You cannot defend the compact on legal grounds. You can only defend it on cultural frustration. And cultural frustration is not a constitutional basis for government control. So let's take a look at the because we fund you argument, which is what she's pitching. The backbone of Melman's justification is this: the government gives universities money so it can demand whatever it wants to in return. That's her version of constitutional reasoning. But here's what the Supreme Court actually has said over the years. Number one, you cannot condition a public benefit on surrendering a constitutional right. In other words, grants, federal grants, do have strings attached, do have conditions attached, but they have to be legitimate conditions. For example, in my business, I was very involved with the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. I served on the Federal Advisory Committee for Juvenile Justice, which advises the President and Congress on juvenile justice issues. And there is a particular congressional act going way back to the 70s, which is the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act. And there are 4 core protections that states if they're to receive money, they must comply with it. Okay? And these are conditions that are based upon evidence-based standards about what works in juvenile justice. All right? And if you don't comply, then you get penalized. You lose 20% of your funding, and the remaining funding, which is 80%, has to be redirected to fix the problem. Okay? So yeah, you can lose your grant, but the problem is when the government starts handing out benefits, okay, there's one thing they can't do in terms of tying a condition to it, and that is a condition that violates your fundamental right to do something. The First Amendment, the Second Amendment, things like that. All right, second, you cannot use federal funds to force ideological conformity. Okay, um, that's the viewpoint discrimination. You cannot punish institutions for speech the administration dislikes. Same thing there as well. You cannot create hiring quotas based on viewpoint. You cannot silence political or social expression in exchange for research dollars. Melman's core argument was struck down before she graduated middle school. And if she filed a legal brief with the reasoning she uses in the interviews, any federal judge would treat it like a pinata. So, at the same time in the interview, I picked up that, between the lines and some express language that she knows the risks and she admits them. Okay. There's a moment in her interview where Melman acknowledges the intellectual diversity provision, the demand that universities hire more conservatives, would be difficult for the government to enforce. Of course it would, because you see that's unconstitutional, right? Okay. She even concedes that going department by department to enforce ideological hiring would be too invasive. But how does she resolve this contradiction? Not by reconsidering the policy, but by shrugging and saying the government should still push universities anyway. This is the part where my judicial brain short circuits. If you admit something cannot be enforced constitutionally, the next step is not, let's do it anyway, but gently. That's not policy. That's a confession and an indictment of the entire compact. So, what happens when culture becomes a pretext for control? I want to talk about that. Melman's interview is full of cultural grievances. Universities are too woke. DEI has gone too far. Students are too sensitive. Professors are too liberal. Intellectual diversity is lacking. Leadership is weak. Anti-Semitism is rising. Tuition is outrageous. These issues deserve honest debate. There are some among those that I said, yeah, there's no problem. You may, and my listeners here, if you've read my essays early on, I wrote an essay complaining about the shout outs or the shout downs that these young college students were doing when they brought in these conservative speakers, and they were interfering with their right to free speech. The university brought them in order to uh, provide more diverse thinking. Knowing the bottom line is most college students, the vast majority of college students are already left leaning anyway. Okay, that's statistically been found out in many surveys. Okay, in fact, I have an essay that's coming out on this particular topic regarding Miss Melman. Okay, in an essay form, and I cite the studies on this. My point is, okay, is that is that you know these students, I guess, in their youth, they're still uh, engineering and development of their adolescent brains. Okay, um, are still having trouble addressing conflict, and so they, in their left-leaning ways, they see these conservative people come in, like let's say a Charlie Kirk, okay, and others come in, and they would go over there and not let him speak by shouting down. Okay. That upset me. All right. And I'm left of center, but I'm a big academic freedom person. I teach college courses. All right. And I believe that conservative ideas need to be uh, dispersed into the open dialogue. And I think that these young people would do better if they would listen to them. Not necessarily that they would have to agree, but help maybe articulate their position on the left side a little bit more sharper. Okay. Or it may end up having them say, well, maybe I'm going too far on the left. I don't know, but I think you get the point I'm trying to make here. Um, but going on with her grievances, she says students are too sensitive. I agree, right? That's the point I'm trying to make, you know. Leadership is weak. In fact, there's a lot of concerns that there's a lot more administrators than there are teachers at the college setting. Okay, and I agree that tuition is outrageous. All right. I'm a co-signer on 2 college loans right now. Oh my goodness. They're not exactly helping my credit report. So these issues do deserve honest debate. But here's my thing, ladies and gentlemen. Culture's, culture is not law. And cultural frustration is not a constitutional justification for forced ideological conformity. The First Amendment does not transform because a presidential advisor dislikes the direction of campus culture. In fact, that is when the First Amendment is supposed to be the strongest. So let's take a look at what is the most dangerous logic of all. Millman repeatedly argues that universities can just opt out of federal funding, like Hillsdale. This is the legal equivalent of saying, if you don't want your speech restricted, stop breathing. Now, Hillsdale, as she mentioned in the interview, is a tiny private liberal arts college that chooses isolation, and it is a conservative institution. But you take a look at Harvard, Arizona, MIT, UCLA, and Stanford, all those on the list of being targeted by the administration. They're research institutions at the heart of national security, medicine, engineering, scientific discovery, economic competitiveness, space exploration. Folks, they cannot opt out without gutting American innovation. I mean, to bring up Hillsdale, that they should be like Hillsdale, that's apples and oranges, and she ought to know better as an attorney. And here's the thing. The Supreme Court has already rejected this logic. Coercion is unconstitutional even if opting out is theoretically possible. Mellman's argument is not constitutional reasoning. It is forced choice fallacy. So let's talk about, as we close here, why this matters. So why devote a full post-epilogue episode to this? You see, because Mellman is not some distant commentator. She's one of the architects of this policy. She negotiated the settlements. She applied federal pressure. She shaped the structure of the compact, okay? And despite being an attorney working at the highest level of government, she never once addresses or even acknowledges the constitutional limits that bind government action. And you know what? That's really not an oversight. Because if I don't say this, I don't want any of my listeners to think that I'm saying she's not worth her salt as an attorney. No, I'm saying quite the opposite. It's not an oversight because it's strategy, and she knows it. Okay. She knows all these constitutional doctrines and principles stand in the way. Even she has admitted it to some degree in her interview, okay, with trying to hire more conservative professors. So she is extremely intelligent, smart, and don't get me wrong here, okay? I am not by inference saying that she's not a good attorney. That's not what I'm saying. In fact, what she's doing, she's in a position that she can't really bring it up because she knows it's not helpful. Now, because when you're trying to compel ideological obedience from universities, the Constitution is really not your friend. Universities saw this clearly. 7 of 9 rejected the compact immediately. And you know what? So should we. Because academic freedom isn't absolute because it's perfect. It's absolute because government power is dangerous. And when federal strategists start treating universities as ideological subsidiaries, we are no longer talking about reform. We are talking about coerced silence. And the First Amendment has a response waiting on the page. No law, no exceptions, no obedience required. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening in. I hope this is finally the conclusion of this series on the Compact for Obedience. I'm working on my next series, and we'll be introducing that with some clips in social media and on Substack. And so in the meantime, everyone, be safe and take care. Bye now.